Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. It's my pleasure to invite you or to join you in this third marketplace session of the Data Knowledge Working Group of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. My name is Atle Solberg. I'm head of the PDD Secretariat, and we are based in Geneva. We are very pleased to be able to be with you today over 3 sessions. And in this meeting of the Data Knowledge Working Group, which is co-chaired between the International Organization for Migration and Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC. It's part of the advisory committee of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And it is a very important tool for the work we are doing. The work of PDD is very much at the intersection, on one side, research, evidence and analysis, and policy development. So all the work that can be done to strengthen knowledge and data will also support our policy work. For us, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, a strategic priority is to enhance evidence and data on disaster displacement and other forms of human mobility in the context of disaster and adverse effect of climate change. And it has been a priority since the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda that also identify data and evidence as a priority. So we're very happy to see how these events today can support us in furthering these objectives. I hope you have seen a video that was prepared by the co-chair of the Data Knowledge Working Group and the envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, Professor Walter Kalin. So I will not repeat what was in that video. I do assume that you have seen or heard the video. If you didn't have the opportunity, you can do this after this meeting. We have a few housekeeping rules on how to do or to undertake this meeting. And I just want to kindly remind all of you that firstly, the meeting is recorded and we will share the meeting recording on the websites in a public space. We ask all of you to please switch off your camera unless you are speaking. Please also mute yourself at all times unless the chair gives you the floor. In order to have an interactive session, we invite you to use the raise hand function to request the floor, or alternatively write in the chat box if you want to take the floor. So I will monitor that chat box and also the signals from my moderation role. We also ask you to please name your organization affiliation with your question. That makes it easier to refer to them and also to put them to one of our speakers. We have a packed agenda for this third session. We have about 90 minutes for 5 presentations. We also have 2 other colleagues that will be invited to give an update on some of their work. So I will introduce them when that is relevant and applicable. You have the agenda in front of you. And I think without much further ado, I will introduce each speaker when they will be speaking. So it's my pleasure to invite Mr. Andrew Harper, the Special Advisor on Climate Action with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. He's also supported by Mr. Eric Bonnet in his presentation. And Andrew and Eric will speak about Sahel predictive analytics. So Andrew, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Ale. Just share. Okay, so I hope everyone's got the screen now. Yep. Okay, so you'll see that the, and just taking note of 4:05. So you'll see that the screen is the 1st of October 2020, so that's not a mistake. What I thought I'd do is actually just do the same presentation that I made to the UN High-Level Committee on Programs, which involves some 20 to 30 UN agencies, because what we are looking at here is not the interest of just one agency. We're looking at the impact of climate change on almost the DNA of every actor that's working in the Sahel. And so what we've got is, now trying to make this work, what we've got is we recognize the challenges that exist in the Sahel. So what is it that we can do in relation to using innovative data, AI, machine learning, to enhance the effectiveness? Because let's face it, there's been a lot of challenges for the UN making an impact there. And so rather than just doing the same old type of programming, what we've been trying to investigate is, can we actually use the data that's being collected in a much more cohesive, coordinated, anticipatory way to better inform future developments? And so the key element here is it's not just a humanitarian or displacement issue. It involves humanitarian development, peace building, and security. So in that context, we said that we need to ensure that everyone has a better understanding of what, or a common understanding of what the major trends will be in the Sahel in the future, and what will be the impact on those on the operations. So Eric and myself went out and spoke to some 20 plus different agencies and sort of said, look, if we go forward with such a project, what is it that you actually want out of it? It's no use having a project involving predictive analytics unless it's answers a specific question. And so that was one of the key elements, going to the various agencies and just trying to get clarity from them about what is it they're actually trying to achieve in the Sahel, not only this year, but in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, and how would a project be useful for them. So that actually took a lot of time, something like 6 months. We put out a survey. Eric undertook some 50 interviews. And what we found is there's just a complete disarray of understanding about what the UN was trying to achieve in the Sahel, both from the headquarters level, the regional level, and the country level. We've also been linking up with a number of thought leaders in the area, whether it be Potsdam Institute, CIPRI, ProPublica, and New York Times. And we're now also reaching out to Uppsala University as well, just to see what evidence and what data and what modeling they've been using. What has been key has been to ensure that when we look at a predictive analytics model, that it's not just for the interests of ourselves, but it feeds into the overall UN integrated strategy for Sahel. Because in the end, the objective is that such a model and such work would eventually land in the region and not be divorced from. It needs to be fitting into the overall strategy in the Sahel to meet the needs of member states. And so we spent a lot of time talking to agencies, talking to UNIWAS, trying to ensure that what we've been developing fits the bill, fits the requirements on the ground. What have we learned? There's a lot of really good work already being undertaken out there, like whether it be from WFP, FAO, World Bank, HCR, OCHA, IOM's transhumance programs. A lot of people are doing a lot of good work. Is it linked in together? No, not really. Is data collected in the way which is easily transferable? No. Is there remaining proprietary issues over data? Absolutely. Is there sufficient acknowledgement of the dynamics at the community level? No. So there's a lot of work. There's a lot of really good work, but are we taking advantage of it in the way which we need to better inform the overall programming? No. Is there a lot of wasted opportunities? Absolutely. So the challenges as we've got it there, we just basically synthesized it back down to the basics. Is there a lack of standardized high quality data? Absolutely. Is there no means to share data? People are still collecting data in Excel spreadsheets. There's still no commonalities or definitions being used by different agencies. Data's not being consistent, timely, or in many instances accurate. So a lot of work, but not necessarily being used in the way which we would require. So what the recommendations that we made to the UN is that we need to anchor this within UNIWAS. So there is ownership there, and that we provide the support. we utilize best-in-class such as HCX, such as HDX, and that we have a much more disciplined approach from UN agencies in this instance, because my let's say marching orders was to look at the UN overall, but that would be very much also to every interested party in working in the Sahel who are looking for the betterment of the populations there, and to enhance the capacity and confidence and credibility of these statistical agencies in each one of the countries. So what could we be doing? The data needs to be in a format that can be automated and shared in real time, and needs to be in a way which is accessible and can integrate with other key stakeholders' data needs. What are our priorities? Reaching out to Potsdam, other academic institutions, ECOWAS, the institutes within the Sahel. Look at cataloging the work that's being undertaken so far. Also link into early warning, early action mechanisms that already exist, particularly within the AU, African Union, and look at maybe reducing the ambitions to what we had initially had hoped for, and maybe just sort of say what will be the populations most at risk and where between now and the next 5 years based on current trends. So we're looking at the best practices so far, and we've got some examples. Again, almost every agency has been out there, and I know that IOM's not being mentioned there, but IOM's transhumance program is also being very good, but taking advantage where we can of the existing models and trying to link them in a much more progressive, anticipatory way provides an enormous amount of opportunities. There are some already predictions that we can make, or estimates. Again, as soon as you start looking at one model, it will be proved wrong. But overall, we can expect, for instance, that Burkina's population will more than double, food production may be halved. You'll have significant increases in population in Mali and Niger, reduction in food capacity. And again, this is utilizing a number of different sources. The World Bank's obviously done a lot of really good work on the food productivity in these various areas. We've got UN Population Fund, who's been doing a lot of work on the demographics, as well as UN DESA. So there's quite a few elements that are already in play, which we can already utilize. So if these estimates are already quite clear, how can we already start overlaying them in areas which have got concern to us? And this is where we've got issues and where there's already been mapping of where there's conflict. And so if you overlay critical instances with food insecurity, with increasing challenges with food productivity, and these areas are going to be hit more and more by climate change, then you can expect there's going to be increasing challenges and accelerators for population displacement. So we want to try and keep it relatively simple, but the implications are quite significant. This sort of just gives us an idea of the project timeline, and that was basically it. So that was within my 10 minutes. Over. Atle.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very good, and I think that is a good start to look into one theme in this this session, which is also about projections and being having predictive capacity. I want to invite, if there is somebody that has a burning question for Andrew, what we wanted to do in this session, that we also want to have a couple of minutes after each presentation. So I'm now monitoring a little the chat box, and also if somebody will like to raise their hand, if there are some burning questions. I should probably have told everyone this before Andrew spoke, but maybe I can go with one question, Andrew. Can you give me a sense, and this is coming really from a layperson, the conflict or the security situation seems to be extremely volatile and changing, the political situation. How do you factor in these variables that can basically turn your model upside down in a couple of hours, in a couple of days, based on omission or commission of political acts? So maybe if you want to answer that question, we can take a little pause on that. Over to you.
Well, basically, models can only give you provide indicators. They're never going to give you the complete roadmap of where a country is going. It can outline key concerns, vulnerabilities, trends, but in the end, you also have to make sure the model is informed by the context in which you're putting it. And so this is where the situation in Ethiopia would be so critical, because Ethiopia could go any number of ways. You've got a whole range of strategic issues that need to go into play there. So what we would be looking at with the modeling is that is it likely to become more tenuous for governments to govern and be accountable to their populations? And that's likely to be the case in many instances in the Sahel, because you're just not going to have the means for governments to secure, let's say, taxable income. It's going to be increasingly challenging for governments to provide basic health services, education facilities. It's already challenging based on the current population, but what happens if the population doubles within the next 20 or 30 years? Where are they going to be having the resources to do that? And we've seen in the past where we've looked at indicators of potential conflict, we've seen a decline in governance, a decline in accountability, a decline in the provision of basic services as often a precursor to conflict. And so again, we're not expecting the model to provide all the answers, but we are expecting it to indicate whether the situation is likely to deteriorate, and in what areas is it most likely to deteriorate faster. And most importantly, not just to be looking at the negative element, we want these models to support anticipatory planning, engagement and preparedness. Can resources be better allocated? Can we be involved more in supporting development, peace building activities, rather than on the response to disasters? So in the end, having people on the ground informing the models is what's most critical. And that's why we need to have these elements landed in something like UNIWAS, which has the humanitarian development and peace building capacity there. Over.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'm sure people will come back to you later also when we have a general discussion on questions. And I have another one which I would like you to ponder about. It looks like quite a challenging task to coordinate within the United Nations. You have quite a lot of UN agencies, so maybe park that for time being. Then I think we can move to our second presenters. I'm very happy to welcome Kanta Kumari, who's a lead environmental specialist with the World Bank. And thank you so much, Kanta. You're coming back to us and sharing your great work. And it's always a pleasure to hear from you. So we will now hear about the Groundswell model version 2 enhancement for recent work in Africa. So Kanta, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Atli, for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here and to participate in the conversation. I was listening earlier as well, and great to be here. What I'd like to do today is share with all of you some work that we've been doing through the World Bank that's really around a report, a flagship report that we put out about 2 years ago, that we worked in collaboration with CSIN, Columbia University, with the CUNY Institute of Demographic Research and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And what I'll do today is to present to you some of the enhancements to the work that we started, which has been funded by GIZ and the German Corporation, as well as NDF and GFDRR. So we're really grateful to this expanding partnership that we have. But let me just provide you, before I go into the enhancements, a snapshot of where we're coming from when we started this work. This work really started in the context, I think, that Andrew has laid out very nicely. There is an issue that's emerging in the context for us in the development space, in the context of climate change. And what we understand and we know is that climate impacts are intensifying, and they will continue to escalate in the coming times. That I think is a reality that we have to live with. We also know that more and more people are being displaced, and sometimes these are protracted movements. So really the genesis of the Groundswell was to understand, putting that sort of longer term perspective, what is that potency of climate, particularly with the focus on the slow onset, to drive migration within countries in the coming decades. And this is really important so that we can inform policymakers on the potential scale of the issue and sort of spur that early action and far-sighted planning. So this was really the motivation behind this piece of work. And what we were interested to do was to come up with a sense of what is that scale of issue across a larger spatial scale. And we worked with the modeling team to use what I think is a very well-established model on sort of the population gravity, which looked at spatial population distributions into the future. And we tried to inject the slow onset climate factors into that. What we did was we developed plausible different scenarios that could sort of help us to look at how this could potentially play out and what would be the sort of trade-offs and action areas that we need to address. So it's not just looking at the scale issue, but also looking at the spread, the spatial dimension, which is so key. We built off databases that already existed. So the plausible scenarios drew from the representative concentration pathways, which represent emissions, and the development pathways, which are the shared socioeconomic pathways. But what we did in terms of climate was we went beyond what normally has been used in terms of exposure to temperature, precipitation, but we used the global crop and water simulations, which are really the state-of-the-art computer simulations, which can be taken down to the spatial level. And these are particularly relevant when we're thinking about the people who are most exposed to climate impacts, and these impacts their livelihoods. And then we factored in and brought in a mask on sea level rise, but compounded by storm surge, because we know it's a storm surge that really impacts the people, their assets, and disrupts services. So these were the three slow onset factors that we looked at. But we want to also underscore that while we looked at it top down from developing the model, the results in each case, particularly in the country case studies that we developed in the first round, we contextualized them into what was already happening in the current and historic mobility, underpinned that with peer-reviewed literature and the local considerations. I think Andrew was highlighting that, and that's come up. So this is really just a quick snapshot of the approach that we use. As we mentioned, we use three scenarios: the pacifistic reference scenario, which is high emissions, unequal development, and then we modulated that with something that is more climate friendly, alike with the Paris Agreement, but continued unequitable development. And on the other hand, we had the more inclusive development scenario. So we brought the data sets together, the climate data sets, the demographic and the climate impact models, and ran this for a 14-kilometer grid cell applying the gravity model. And this was how we looked at sort of the spatial distribution shifts that could be attributed to climate, and that's the climate migration at the grid cell level. And then we aggregated it up to the national and regional level and contextualized those results for specific case studies to illustrate how the model could actually help us to understand and plan for that. In the new enhancements that I will talk in the next slide too, we added what we call the optimistic scenario. This is really where we have the best of both worlds: good inclusive development coupled with low emissions pathways in the line of Paris. So let me share with you some of the enhancements to the model. What we did in this round of work with CSIN, with CUNY, and with input from Potsdam, was brought in some additional climate-related elements and others. One that we brought in was the net primary productivity. We know particularly that this is really important in the context of pastoral livelihoods, but also in terms of ecosystem stability. And I might add here, by the way, that these enhancements that we did are focused on West and East Africa. In West Africa, particularly with the focus on the coastal countries, and in East Africa, the Lake Victoria Basin countries. So net primary productivity was one that we added. We also added median age and sex ratios, but conflict, I think, is something that we put in as a layer. We don't model conflict per se, but we built off the ACLED data to understand what were the locations of some of these conflicts. And in the context of the gravity model, conflict-related areas tend not to attract more people in the future and have consequences on the development context and the peace and security as well. And we also brought in data sets on flood risk as an extreme event. So you see that we developed these coefficients based on a parametrization that we did from 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2010. And that was really to pick out the climate signal that was already within those time periods. And that's then used to project forward using these coefficients. You can see that water is a particularly potent factor, and the others play out accordingly. But what the other thing to note is that, while we look at the coefficients, the way that each of these additional aspects that we looked at has a certain minimum and maximum value. These are not comparable across those elements, but they also show you the potency of some of these elements to drive mobility in the context of specific areas. And you can see, for example, mobility has a pretty large range, and it's a potent factor in itself. Very quickly then, I want to sort of sum up with what have we learned from these enhancements. If you look on the right-hand side, you see at the bottom, that's what we had in the Groundswell version 1, and on the top, what's what we have in Groundswell version 2. So the important thing that we are finding is that there is some consistency in the patterns and trends, and the hotspots seem to prevail. So there's sort of some certainty that some of these areas will be climate in migration and others climate out migration, as depicted by the scenarios. But within the scenarios, you will see that inclusive and climate-friendly scenarios can reduce that scale of climate in and out migration. So we're not set in stone, but there are things that we can do. So it really gives you a way to visualize over time and space, what are some actions we can take. But in terms of the actual magnitude of what we found in Groundswell 1 and 2, we found that the numbers could go up and down slightly. And part of this is one of the things that we did in the Groundswell 1, we modeled the mobility over a 14-kilometer grid cell. In Groundswell version 2, we reduced that to 1 kilometer and then aggregated it to 14 kilometers. Now, what this does is very important because it shows you that there are a lot of intervening opportunities that communities could avail of themselves. And this is really important also in the context of the development responses that we can provide. And we know we've all heard about how adapt-in-place works and how planned processes can work. But these intervening opportunities and how we actually provide the kind of resources for communities to overcome some of the hardships that are posed by the climate context in this case can make a difference. But at the same time, I think these enhancements are providing us a more robust basis in the context of the work that we are doing in West and East Africa. We've taken the model results and are right now contextualizing them much more rigorously in terms of historical migration patterns, in terms of impacts already evident on sectors, on water stress, on environmental stress, and what has that revealed in terms of the way in which communities are coping or adapting. And this is really, really important because as you can see, this is a map of Tanzania, and we can see the spatial shifts and the climate in migration starting as early as 2030. If we don't do things differently, and will intensify to 2050. But from a development and a poverty perspective, what I think is very clear in this visual is that it's the poverty areas around Lake Victoria and sort of some of the other coastal areas where people will be sort of having to move out of will be particularly exposed to this kind of impacts. And it really means that, you know, if we want to address some of the poverty and some of the welfare, we need to really act on these areas. But what is the other message in Tanzania? It's sort of the cities in the coastal belt, which are sort of better off and have lower poverty. They will also see a dampening of climate out migration. And again, it means that we really need to have far-sighted and anticipatory approaches on both ends of the spectrum. Even as Tanzania continues to make progress, these are sort of, you know, hot button issues that could unravel some of these contexts. So maybe just to add here, to say that, you know, as we continue to work on this work and make it more real and to contextualize it, we believe that this work is beginning to provide a novel and a transparent way to sort of do some of the modeling, bring in more aspects to it, contextualize it, so that we can really engage in an informed basis to drive that policy dialogue and action on the ground. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanta. That was great. And we already have some questions for you. So let's dive into that. There are two questions. I think we take one in this session, and then we save the other one for the general discussion. I don't know whether you can see the chat field, Kanta, but I'll read the question from John Madasita. Question for Kanta. I see that there is the improved resolution between version 1 and 2 from 14 kilometers to 1 kilometer. Is there any hope for Groundswell to be applied to small island states that previously wouldn't have been feasible with the 14-kilometer resolution?
Thank you very much, John. That's a good question, and I must recognize Alex is also here. And we are working, in fact, the work that I've talked about right now is focused on West and East Africa, applying the enhancements. But even as we speak, we in the World Bank, the first Groundswell report, we focus on Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. We are producing Groundswell too to cover the rest of the regions that we hadn't covered. The Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, East Asia, and we will have a special section on the small island states. Some of the larger islands, we will apply the model, but in the rest, we will do it in a qualitative way, just like we would do in the case of Middle East because of higher mobility than migration. So stay tuned. We hope to have that report, which will include the small islands in the springtime of next year.
Thank you, Kanta. And we also have a question from Christian Koenig. But I propose that you monitor the chat a little, and then we do a roundup in the general discussion. So thank you so much, Kanta. Great work. And this brings us to our third presenters today. I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Alex de Sherbenin. He's Associate Director at the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, CSIN, Columbia University in New York. And Alex will speak on novel and big data approaches to identifying disaster displacement. So Alex, you have the floor.
I need to unmute. So greetings, thank you, Atle, for that introduction. And I have quite a few slides, so I'm going to just go right into it here. But I wanted to acknowledge my colleagues at CSIN and some interns that we hired over the last year and a half on a project that was funded by Schmidt Futures. Eric Schmidt was the founder of Google, and so he provided some money to the Columbia University Data Science Institute, and we were recipients of a small amount of funding. And we actually linked this work really directly to the work of the Platform for Disaster Displacement, which is why I have the logo there. Let me just click here. And so I think we've already had the problem statement very clearly made by Sylvain Poncer in the earlier session, and which is really that humanitarian groups in many cases do not have the data they need on. We do know a lot more about immediate displacement, but we don't know as much about returns And there are a lot of uncertainties in the data because we're often talking about conflict or disaster situations with a lot of chaos. So there's obviously great interest in these novel data streams to fill the gaps. And so what we did through this Schmidt Futures funded work is look at two possible sources of data in two different contexts of disasters. One is a Skyhook device location data, and the other is VIIRS nighttime lights data. And I'm going to describe each in separate slides. So the Skyhook data are data that are cross-platform device location data based on Wi-Fi, GPS, and cell tower signals. So what, in plain English, this is that your computer or your smartphone has a MAC ID, and it basically connects to a Wi-Fi hotspot or GPS tower. And depending on what service provider you're using for a particular application, say the weather app, you will have that location information will be channeled through that provider. So Skyhook is one of a number of different providers. Google and a number of others provide this kind of device location information. It has hourly temporal resolution. It has a number of advantages, potential advantages over the most other widely used data set for humanitarian purposes, which is the call detail records that cell phone service providers keep. So one of the advantages is that this uses smartphones, computers, laptops, and gaming devices, not just phones. It includes Wi-Fi hotspots and not just cell phone towers, and does not require MOUs with each cell phone provider. For those of you familiar with call detail records, you need to actually enter into an MOU with a specific provider, say Orange Telecom in parts of Africa. But as soon as you cross the border, you need to have another provider provide that information. And so those groups like Flowminder have actually developed those MOUs, and they've been very successful, but there's still a lot of overhead administratively in setting these up. The disadvantages with these kind of device location data are that the market penetration varies by location service provider. And you can't track individual devices, so we cannot actually, I think the actual provider, Skyhook, could provide that information, but obviously they have confidentiality reasons for not divulging where individuals are actually moving. And devices need to be data enabled. So these are not this may not be as appropriate in the least developed countries where, for instance, a lot of people use flip phones. So one basic question we wanted to answer, and this was this part of my presentation focuses on kind of exploratory data analysis, is essentially how well correlated the device location information, the number of MAC IDs attaching to individual hotspots, actually is correlated to population. What you can see here is that in some states, you have a high number of device IDs or MAC addresses detected, like Nuevo León, which is in the northern part of Mexico where Monterrey is, whereas in other very poor states like Chiapas, relative to the population, there's a much fewer number of people using these devices. And this is borne out in a map. On the left, you see population distribution for Mexico, and on the right, you actually see the concentration of mean users per 4-hour bin across Mexico in a 7-day period in 2018, 8-day period, pardon me. And essentially, you see a far higher concentration of device IDs in urban areas than you do actual population. You can also see from the data a diurnal pattern of drop off in the middle of the night and then a peak in the morning when people first turn on their devices, then a slight drop off and then an increase again. And you can actually look at these patterns over the course of a 24-hour period for different days. So we did that and we looked at different days of the week, and for instance, Saturdays and Sundays in Mexico and Mexico City in particular, you see a drop-off in usage. You can also look at by neighborhood the relationship between population distribution and users on the x-axis. So on the left, you basically see business area traversed by major roads, and on the right, you see a more residential neighborhood. And once you know these, you can kind of identify these distinct patterns. You can actually divide up Mexico City based on cluster 0 would be on the left, which is the main business districts, and on the right, the blue areas, in particular residential areas, with different patterns of cell phone and device usage during the day. This is just a bit of eye candy to show that you can actually animate the data, and you can see how actually one of the things that kind of confounds a little bit of this analysis is that devices are appear along major roadways in particular. So you see a high concentration in kind of linear patterns in Mexico City during certain days of the week. You can also see the fact that there's fewer numbers of devices connecting on Saturday and Sunday compared to the rest of the week. So we wanted to then use this device location data in the case of the Jakarta floods in January of this year. So this was January 1st. What you see on this slide, I don't know if you can see my cursor, is a very dramatic drop off in the number of devices connecting right around New Year's Day. And that was because there was a major flood with 400 millimeters of rainfall that evening. So what we know about Jakarta is that there are large portions of the city, particularly in the north, that are very low elevation. According to one source, now this is Wikipedia, and I don't want to pretend that I know for sure this is factual, but they say that 40% of Jakarta is below sea level. In fact, we have data to show that there are, according to our elevation data anyway, people and devices in some of those below zero mean sea level area, above mean sea level areas. But you can see the population distribution relative to elevation in these two maps. So on the left side, what we have is the number of 100 meter by 100 meter tiles from Skyhook, where the average number of devices used increases after the flood. So the red areas show increases. One of the interesting things, I think, is that you see some increases in device attachment in this location here, which happens to be an area that is a little bit higher elevation compared to the rest of Jakarta. What we see on the right side is the change in the number of devices by elevation in the Jakarta area. Well, basically in any area below 60 meters sea level, below 60 meters above sea level. And what you see here is that there's actually more declines in the areas just below sea level, and slightly more declines in the area just above sea level. These are the blue dots, compared to increases, which are more concentrated in the higher elevation zones. Again, not a conclusive evidence, but some evidence to show that there's some movement out of the very lowest elevation areas. Of course, one thing we don't know for sure is there may have been some outages and some of the tiles may not have been reporting as many cases because of network outages or Wi-Fi outages in the city. I'm not going to go into this, but what you see is by elevation, actually, if you go up higher elevation, you have Bandung, and then you have Jakarta, and just the change in the device counts is much higher in these major urban areas. In terms of VIIRS data, it has some other characteristics that are useful. It's a spatial resolution of 1 kilometer. It has a temporal daily resolution that is daily temporal resolution, has advantages such as high spatial and temporal resolution. It's already been proven to be useful for things like electric grid outages, for instance, after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And some of the disadvantages is that if you cannot tell if people left the area. It's just really a metric of outages of electrical grid. So you don't know what happened to the people. I'm going to skip through some slides because I see Atlay showing up and he's nodding at me that I'm running short on time. So this was an example of an earthquake in Oaxaca state. It occurred some distance from the Oaxaca city. But what we were able to do is look at the patterns of device usage before and after the quake and lighting. And frankly, the results were somewhat inconclusive. Lighting did decline closer to the epicenter. This is the closest location near the epicenter. and this is the distance from the epicenter going out on the x-axis. So lighting decreased closest to the epicenter, but we saw no real pattern in changes in device usage near the epicenter. By way of conclusion, I'll just say that the Skyhook data, one issue we may be facing in Mexico is they don't have as much penetration in the app market in Mexico as they do in Indonesia. We would also really want to have persistent IDs for each device to see where people actually move, but we are not able to get those data. And furthermore, it should be stated that if a climate-related disaster such as a cyclone, a storm, a flood, a landslide knocks out the electrical grid network, lights and networks go down, which may have little to do with displacement. It may just be a function of the electrical grid going down. So in essence, we found that these data have some potential strengths, but there's still a lot more work to be done in order to kind of achieve what we hope will be useful results from using these two sources. Very briefly, I just wanted to say, building off of what Concha just presented related to the Groundswell work, that we're actually planning to refine that model even further in some work with African Union Commission, UNDP, and of course the World Bank, funded by the Robert Bosch Foundation. And we're going to be gearing up very shortly. The focus will be much more on historical trends and displacement in Africa and future projections out to 2050, but with much more emphasis on sort of rapid onset and maybe a bit more emphasis on short-term displacement events. And that's going to be challenging, but we are proud, and very happy to be working with some of the best minds, including groups like IDMC, and we'll be working with them to build out the iDetect data. So with that, I'll close and stop sharing my screen. Thank you for your forbearance, Atle.
Thank you, Alex. That's fascinating. I really think this is truly remarkable, and I think there are clearly opportunities, and we're very excited to follow this work further. I also invite everyone now if there are some burning questions for Alex, but while you ponder that, I'm also very pleased to introduce a speaker that is not part of that wasn't listed in the program, but also speaks to these issues of big data. And Alex, you mentioned FlowMinder. So I'm very pleased to let Veronica Lefebvre, Head of Analysis of FlowMinder Foundation, to say a few words what you are doing and how these also complement some of the work we have been listening to. So thank you so much for joining us, Veronique, and you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, hi everyone. So yeah, indeed, I lead the analysis work at FlowMinder. Yeah, thank you, Alex, for mentioning also our work during your presentation. So yeah, somewhat similar to what Alex just presented. So we're a non-profit organization. We do data science work to support decision makers in low and middle income countries. And I would say the main data source we work with is mobile phone usage data. And so we use this to measure movement of population. So in a near real-time manner, in a timely manner, and also on a large scale, but indeed within one country. So these data, they are not like Google location history data or GPS tracks. They are called detailed records. So that is when people make or receive a call or send an SMS, receive one, or use mobile data. There's a record of that by the mobile network operators with a location of the nearest tower that routes the interaction. So that's the data we have access to, the owners of the mobile network operators. And so what we see from that are trajectories of phone users, but indeed sparse because they depend on active usage. However, when we look at the statistics of it from the whole subscriber base of one country, we can get good group statistics on population movements. So among other use cases, we've used this data a lot to measure displacements following sudden onset disasters, so earthquakes and hurricanes. So looking at where people go right after the disaster, but then also looking at the crisis on a more long-term, months and year after, to see the returns and the recovery trend, also the resettlements in other places. And then more and more what we try to do, so more for preparedness, is to set up automated monitoring system so that the data are analyzed continuously, so that if something happens, the part of the analysis is ready, so we can provide the data quickly as a crisis unfolds. Of course, in some cases, in some events, the part of the network will have been damaged. So that's things we look at as well. Then in terms of predictive modeling, that's something we looked at in a project with DTM and IDMC. For example, trends and patterns that we saw is that how far would people be displaced from their home would tend to be very linked to the spatial distribution of their social network. People who have 100%, nearly 100% of their social contact living next to their home would tend to stay within the area, even if it's severely affected, rather than being displaced in other regions and further away. Yeah, so that's roughly for the work we do. I also want to say that we do this in a privacy conscious manner, so that we never give data at the individual level. It's always group statistics, so that we make sure that individual trajectories cannot be retrieved from this. And also we try to work as much as we can with other organizations and also other data sources, more to complement data that are being measured on the field. One of the problems of mobile phone usage data is the data from phone users, and also mainly the more frequent ones. So it's not representative of the whole population. So it has to be cross-integrated with other data sources. But then it can serve to make inference in between field assessments or before data collection has happened in the field, and then also more long-term monitoring after a crisis. So generally very happy to welcome partnerships and to discuss data sharing whenever possible. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronique, and we're so glad that you could join us today, and I look forward to also being in contact. I also really get the sense that many of these partners you are working together. Alex, I see that you are communicating in the chat. Do you want to speak to some of the answer you gave to John, or would you rather wait for the general discussion?
I think my answer is sufficient. We are trying to push the boundaries on small island states, but it's challenging. So I'll leave it there for the reasons of the input data resolution, more so than moving to a 1 kilometer grid in the population baseline. So happy to cede the time to the next presenter.
Great, thank you, Alex, and I think it's great that the chat box is now being used, so evacuate some of the question and answers. So now we will turn the corner a little. I don't know whether that's a good phrase, but we will have a slightly different perspective. We are moving a little from big data modeling, projection, and predictive analytics, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to Robin Bronin from the Alaska Institute for Justice, one of our most long-standing and most active partners in the advisory committee of the PDD, and also the advisory group of the Nansen Initiative. So Robin Bronin will speak about decolonizing data collection and research. So Robin, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Atley, and thank you so much to the previous presenters. And as you said, the presentation I'm going to make is on a very different perspective. And it's about decolonizing the way that data and research happens to promote self-determination. Because when we're talking about population displacement, And specifically, when we're talking about slow, ongoing environmental change, the right to self-determination is one of the most important human rights to protect. And the focus of our work is making sure that we are able to do that. I'm not seeing where I can promote, go to the next slide. It's not, sorry, I don't see what I need to do that. So maybe I just won't, and I'll just keep talking.
Robin, we can take our time for that. So maybe Eric, I think you need to change it like you would normally do when you either with your arrow button or.
It's not working, and I don't see why. Sorry, I should have checked this out before. Yeah, I don't see any. Is Eric on to help me move it forward?
Robin, if you just try the right arrow on your keyboard.
Yeah, it's not working.
Oh.
Robin, I had to click on my PowerPoint before it would move forward. Did you click on it already? Click on the screen and then use right arrow.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Alex. Yep, it's in the very bottom left-hand corner. Sorry, everyone. It's like all this technology working remotely, I'm trying to keep up. So, so one of the key pieces in the work that we do is first understanding how colonization has worked to cause the communities that we work with in Alaska to be vulnerable, environmentally vulnerable. And in the United States, colonization has been a process of devaluing and dehumanizing Indigenous peoples to justify the exploitation of them and their homelands. And it's also been about imposing laws that are not their laws and epistemologies that are not their epistemologies. And in the context of the issue of population displacement, this issue of forced government mandated relocation is an issue that has happened all over the world. And the World Bank has been one of the recent purveyors of causing government forced relocations. And they've actually created an involuntary resettlement handbook to guide governments of how to do that type of resettlement. And while there's free, prior, and informed consent, what the research has uniformly shown is that government mandated relocations, involuntary relocations, have profoundly harmed the populations that have been relocated. And so the question then is how can we shift that paradigm, promote the right to self-determination, and ensure that the communities that are faced with this awful decision of losing the places they love and live in, how can we make sure that their human rights are protected? And so thank you, Alice, for sending a letter to everybody. This is a letter that several Alaska Native organizations wrote to the National Science Foundation, which is one of the premier foundations in the United States to promote scientific research. And the National Science Foundation had a Navigating the New Arctic proposal process that excluded most of the Alaska Native communities from participating. And so I'm just going to read a couple of sentences from that letter, and I really encourage you to read it. It's a 10-page letter that, while it is about Alaska, I'm sure it's relevant to other parts of the world. So one of the problems is that researchers are coming from outside of the Arctic, outside of Alaska, with no meaningful connections to the Arctic, and they are conducting Western scientific research without communicating with the Alaska Native peoples who have inhabited the Arctic for millennia. And their concern is that outside academics are defining these very critical pieces of Alaska Native culture and livelihoods, food security, well-being, resilience, prosperity, without any explicit knowledge or participation of the Alaska Native community, and that the potential outcomes of such research are dangerous. And in this context of migration, and population displacement, there is a recent National Science Foundation proposal that has been titled, and I don't know a lot about the content, so I'm just going to focus on the title of it, which is called Migration in Harmonies. And when thinking about migration in harmonies in the Arctic, and they're looking at ecosystems and people in movement, it's disconcerting because right now, people's lives are being threatened by the fall storms that are happening, by the climate crisis, which is happening 2 to 3 times faster than the lower latitudes. And at my office, we are getting photos of dead birds and marine mammals that are washing up on the shores of Western Alaska because the ocean is warming so intensely. And so in our work, we try to be really mindful of what we need to do to decolonize these systems and challenge the Eurocentric research methods that undermine local knowledge and experience of population groups. So we work with Alaska Native elders. They have guided all of the work that we have done. My coworkers are Alaska Native. We compensate the tribes for the work that they are doing with us. And we make sure that everything we do, we are getting tribal resolutions so that the tribal governments know what we're doing and are in support of whatever research we are doing with them. It is not about them, it is with them so that they are getting the information that they need. And we've focused on community-based social and environmental monitoring because one of the things that we have learned is that climate change is happening at a very local level and is ecosystem specific. And so it is critical that communities on the front lines are gathering the information they need to make the decisions about how they are going to move forward. And through this work, we've identified a new environmental hazard called USHTEC through the co-production of knowledge. And USHTEC is caused by the combination of erosion, flooding, and permafrost thaw. And it is a Yupik word meaning catastrophic land collapse. So with the community-based erosion monitoring, one of the things that's really important is that local communities need to understand the predictive rate of change of these slow, ongoing environmental events that are happening. So we traveled to several communities with our Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys, trained local communities on using these very simple tools so that they can gather the information for themselves about how erosion is happening. And then they send that information to the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys. So now they are getting access to information about what that predictive rate of erosion is. And then the other thing that we do is, most of Alaska is without roads. And so when we get storms, particularly on the west coast of Alaska, we don't get hurricanes, at least not yet, but we do get hurricane strength winds. And without Arctic sea ice, there are extreme flooding and inundation that happens in these very remote places where there are no evacuation routes. So one of the things that we've done in order to make sure that not only the communities are tracking the severity of the storms, because they are, as Indigenous peoples, they've been tracking it for obviously millennia, but then it's also to scale it up so that they are providing this information to, for instance, the National Weather Service and the National NOAA, so that the information that they're gathering on the ground can be scaled up so that they are getting better information about what is going to be happening in the future. And then I'm going to conclude with, again, going back to the importance of local knowledge and ensuring that the community's right to self-determination is protected. Newtok is one of the communities that has been in a relocation process now for over 20 years. They are still not relocated for a variety of reasons. And these are the principles that they developed in order to protect their human rights. And as you can see, One of those principles is that their voices always come first, and that they have first and final say in making any of the decisions that are going to affect their lives and how they're going to move forward in protecting themselves and their culture. They want to work with outside entities, and they want to be guiding that work. And they want to be able to hire people within their community to learn about data collection, to learn about research skills outside of their own frame of Indigenous knowledge, because they understand that it's the combination of both that will be able to protect them in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. As always, very impactful what you are sharing with us, and really I learned something new today. So that's very interesting. I didn't even know you were doing this work, so that's something I probably missed. So clearly, some of these principles they will travel very well in other places we are working. So thank you so much for this sharing of experiences. I think we are coming so close to a general discussion, and I don't think I see any question to Robin directly. At least I cannot identify it in the chat box. So I suggest we park any question for Robin. I promise that she will have first priority when we come back, and I'm very pleased then to introduce a new set of speakers. So we have the pleasure to have two speakers to talk to us about planned relocation, improving the evidence based on planned relocation. It's Sanjula Vedasinger from the Georgetown University and Erika Bauer from the Stanford University. Both of them long friends of PDD and the Nansen. And I also was told that I should mention that both Erika and Sanjula are affiliated with the Calder Center in Sydney, Australia, another very active member of our advisory committee. So I think with that, I'll give Sanjula the floor, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Atle. And thank you very much too for the opportunity to present our research at this virtual marketplace. So earlier this year, Erika and I started a process to try and improve the evidence base on planned relocations. And I'd like to tell you why we started to do this. We've already heard from Robin about a particular case in Alaska, but we also know that policy and scholarly discourse on planned relocation has gained in prominence over the past years. And this is due in part to a recognition that some states and some communities are using this form of mobility, planned relocation, as a way to move people out of harm's way in the context of hazards and in the context of disasters. And states and communities are using planned relocation as a way to move out of harm's way because it has the potential to mitigate exposure and vulnerability, and also because it offers opportunities for adaptation. And we also know that planned relocation is actually increasingly referenced in multilateral policy instruments. So for example, we saw it early on in the 2010 Cancun Adaptation Framework. We've seen it in the 2015 Sendai Framework, and then more recently in the Global Compact for Migration, as well as the NANSEM Initiative Protection Agenda. But we all also know as a community, based on past practice, that the relocation of populations can undermine socioeconomic prosperity and have negative consequences for cultural practices and knowledge, as well as people's human security. And so in that context, a key question for the policy, the practice and research community is twofold or connected. The first one is, how do you actually carry out planned relocation in a manner that alleviates and ideally eliminates negative consequences for the people who are affected? And secondly, how do you actually ensure that the policies and the processes that are being used to carry out planned relocation are protection and rights sensitive and foster people's human dignity? But really, before any one of us can answer those questions, what you need is a global evidence base on planned relocation cases. And this is really something that we don't have at present. often we tend to focus on just a handful of examples to inform all of our work on policy and practice. What we have is really evidence that's quite piecemeal and uneven across the globe. We don't have granular information about the range of hazards that have prompted relocation decisions. We don't know how often communities are actually initiating planned relocation as compared to governments, and how often these are hybrid cases. We don't know what type of participation mechanisms have been used to ensure that these relocations are inclusive. We have limited information about the configuration of actors who are supporting planned relocation processes. And in fact, much of the knowledge that we have has been adduced through individual cases or based on practice in the development field. So what Erica and I mean when we say we want to improve the evidence base on planned relocation, and what we're actually trying to do is understand the global scale and key characteristics of planned relocation cases that relate to hazards. And what our research will do is provide two key outputs. The first output is essentially a global data set of planned relocation cases that have been identified through English language scholarly and grey literature. And then the second output is essentially an analysis of a subset of these cases to illuminate characteristics related to their context and the design of these cases or processes. We're developing these outputs to support the PDD strategy and work plan. And what we're offering is essentially a preliminary set of data on planned relocation that can serve as a foundation for future research. I'll hand over to Erica to talk about some of our preliminary and teaser findings and conclude later.
Thanks, Sanjula. So what do we mean when we say a planned relocation case? Across the literature, across policy, across practice, there is a tremendous diversity in terminology that's used. Many R words: relocation, resettlement, retreat, increasingly. And there's also many different ways of understanding what these terms mean. But for the purposes of this analysis, we're looking specifically at cases that include 6 key elements. First, a hazard. That's one or more hazards that are either hydrometeorological, floods and storms, geophysical, or environmental, like coastal erosion and sea level rise. We're not looking at technological hazards in this case. Second, we're looking at cases that involve the movement of people, not exclusively assets, like schools. Third, and critically, we're looking at groups of persons or communities of persons, not at the individual or household level. Fourth, we're looking at movements that are intended to be permanent and long-term in nature, in contrast to short-term and temporary evacuations. Fifth, we're looking at cases where there is evidence to suggest there is some form of leadership, coordination, or support, and that might emerge from the communities themselves, as in the cases that Robin so eloquently just described, or in the context of an enabling actor who is supporting the movement. And finally, we're looking specifically at cases that are where there are identifiable sites of origin and destination. So using these 6 criteria, we conducted a literature review of an enormous number of articles and identified over 300 cases that meet these criteria. And today I'm just going to share 3 teaser findings about those cases. So first, when we think about planned relocation, we're most often looking at one very specific spatial pattern, communities that are moving from one unique location of origin to one unique location of destination. However, through this process, we've seen that there are actually a number of cases where one origin community has been split into multiple destination sites. And conversely, we've seen a number of cases where multiple origin communities have converged and are moved to one destination site. And finally, cases where multiple origins have moved to multiple destinations. Currently in policy and practice, and also in research, the distinctions between these spatial patterns are often obfuscated, which prevents understanding of the nuanced differences for assessments, for participation frameworks, for law and policy, with regard to each of these different spatial patterns. Second, We've noticed through this work that this is truly a global phenomenon. We identified over 300 cases in 65 different countries across all inhabited continents of the world. However, as you can see in this infographic, where both the color and the size of the circles indicates the number of cases per site, there is a disproportionate number that are taking place of those that have been identified in English language literature in the Asian context. So over 50% have been identified in Asia, with most in Southeast Asia and then South Asia, as you can see here. And finally, from this work so far, as Robin has already illustrated, most of these planned relocation processes and cases are not taking place in relation to a single hazard trigger, but rather in multi-hazard contexts. It's not just the tidal wave, but it's the compilation of decades of coastal erosion and storm surges and sea level rise that together lead to the necessity of a planned relocation. Of cases that we've identified, approximately 2/3 have been in relation to at least one hazard that may be increasing in intensity and frequency in the context of climate change. In contrast, approximately 1/3 are related to hazards that have less direct links to climate change, for instance, tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, lahars, etc. Finally, it's important to note that even though these planned relocations are taking place in relation to a trigger that may be environmental, there are also tremendous socioeconomic and political factors that are driving the need for relocation. As is the case for individuals, this is also true for entire groups and communities. Back over to you, Sanjula.
So what Eric has highlighted are some of the preliminary findings from our global dataset. But in addition to that, our second output digs a little deeper to analyse a subset of cases to identify some of the key contextual and so-called design characteristics. So we look at roughly 40 cases in a little more depth, and we identify these key contextual characteristics. So we talk about the physical distance from the site of origin to the sites of destination, because this has implications for livelihoods, for example. We analyse the number of households. We talk about whether a given case related to an Indigenous population or not. And in roughly half of the 38 odd cases that we've looked at, they relate to an Indigenous community, and in roughly half of them, they don't. We also look at the duration of the planned relocation. So from the moment that a decision was made to relocate to the actual physical relocation taking place. And as Robin's already highlighted, for some of these cases, they're still ongoing for over 20 years. In terms of the so-called design characteristics, we look at who made the initial decision to relocate. We look at who supported the planned relocation process. We look at whether there were participation mechanisms set up and how inclusive they were. And we look at whether hazard risk and other types of assessments were conducted at the site of origin as well as the site of destination. Whether, for example, a legal framework has underpinned these processes, and finally, some of the key challenges related to livelihoods, but also other dimensions, including whether there are secondary risks of relocation. So do stay tuned. We're well on our way to finalising this report. We're hoping to have it published early next year in January and February, and look forward to your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjula and Erica. Yes, we will stay tuned. We are very excited about this. I think this really has been a gap, this more global systematization of some mappings. I really congratulate you, and thank you so much for doing this together with other partners in PDD. And I look very much forward to follow up on what I think will be a conversation for many years to come around planned relocation. I think that's not, unfortunately, going away. I would like, before we open up a general discussion, we have another colleague that would like to say a few words, and his name is Mr. David Durand-Delac. We had the pleasure to listen to David when he did a presentation of his PhD, and he's talking about climate migration, an idea on the move. Whether David would like to join the advisory committee and the data knowledge working group after today, that's up to him to judge. But anyway, you have now gotten a teaser of what we do under PDD and the data knowledge working group. And David, if you can share with us a few words on your work and some reflection. Then I invite all the speakers to put themselves the video on, and then we have about 5 minutes at the end for a few Q&A. So David, you have the floor first.
Thank you, Atle, for this opportunity to introduce myself and participate in these discussions. I found the 3 sessions today really fascinating. I'm going to be very brief because the work I'm going to describe is very much ongoing and it's part of my PhD. And I'd like to just I'll conclude with a question which may or may not be a subject for discussion today, but which I hope further exchanges can at least occur on. So my name is David Viandolac. I'm a PhD student in the geography department at Cambridge University. I'm trained as a social scientist and a geographer, and my interest primarily at the moment through my PhD is on sort of the politics of climate migration and how this idea has emerged both sort of historically and is currently circulating in different contexts. So concretely speaking, what I'm doing right now is I'm spending a lot of time interviewing researchers, but also NGOs, parliamentarians, journalists, documentary filmmakers, people in government administration, all primarily in France, which is sort of my case study, to essentially understand how each of them makes sense of climate migration in their own ways, which may be more or less influenced by the research that's been discussed today, and also how they make their own interpretations of the expertise that is available, also what expertise is visible to them, because a lot of the time they don't actually have access or struggle to access certain forms of expertise. So the knowledge gap that I identify essentially is really in terms of how the research, such as the one that's produced here in this group, very diverse group, is actually used by a variety of other actors. And crucially, I'm very interested in how our own practices as researchers, which are essentially the things we can control in this relationship that we have with other actors, can play a role in determining sort of the communication and the sort of final result of how this is discussed. Climate migration is discussed in wider public discourse. So my focus is essentially on research communication. It's on policy and media relationships for us researchers, experts on the question. And also it's on sort of the best practices at the sort of research communication level. So what the sorts of maps we create, the numbers we use, the images we produce, and particularly how those are received and interpreted by others who don't necessarily have the expertise and don't necessarily have all the background of how these were produced. So how they make sense of these condensed pieces of information and how those might circulate. So this is very much ongoing work. I don't have much to share really from my results, though I hope to have produced my thesis within the year. But essentially my provocation or my question to the group is really whether or not there is a general feeling that this is an issue that is worth investigating. Is this something that perhaps, I think, for example, Andrew mentioned the New York Times and ProPublica in his presentation. The Groundswell report has received a lot of attention in the news. So I'm curious to hear essentially from the rest of the panelists and the group at large, whether this is an area, research communication, relationships with the media and with policy that may be worth exploring, and also sharing best practices and experiences together, because that's an aspect I've not heard a huge deal on today. So I'll stop there, but I hope this can be the basis for some fruitful discussion. And I thank the panelists today for these very detailed and very interesting presentations.
Thank you, David. And maybe next time we meet, we can hear from you some of the results. I think that's a an opportunity now to maybe, we have 5 minutes left, so I think we can only do one round of comments from all the panelists. So what about everyone turning on their video? Would that be possible? Andrew, Kanta, Alex, Robin, Erika Sandrula, Veronique. And we have monitored the chat, so there are not really any outstanding or pending questions. Thank you to Andrew and Kanta, and I see also Alex, they have been very good at responding to it. So unless I see something coming up in the chat box or somebody wanting to take the floor, there are no specific questions. So I think what I will like to do, and maybe start with Andrew in the order that people have spoken, whether there are some final messages from you or some observation, and also maybe answer David's question, whether that kind of research and on that interface between communication and research, and whether you see any opportunities to engage on that. So,
okay, no, thanks, and thanks to everyone who's participated. The more that I attend these sessions and participate in the various discussions, the more I've got actually confidence that we can have a more articulate understanding of, and scientific understanding of what the world is going to be facing in the years to come, and to better inform the programming that's going to be required and the policies that are going to be required to actually make a difference. That being said, I'm still seeing that there's so many different elements that are working separately and not trying necessarily to seek that synergy. And so with what David was saying, I think is very useful, because in our discussions with the other UN agencies, which is something that you alluded to before, Atle, was that how do you get people together? And I think one of the key elements is you get agencies together, you get academics together, with an expectation that what they're contributing to will make a difference and will have a profile, because in the end, everyone does inertly want to make a difference, and they do want their work to be recognized. And if we can have a degree of ambition that we're working together towards a major issue, and obviously climate and displacement is a major issue in an area which has got such strategic importance as could be the Sahel, could be South Asia, could be Central America, then you do almost have that rallying cry to bring people together, to bring the data, the policymakers, the academics together. So it's just, my call would be that how can we be more, let's say, disciplined in moving from what we are talking about into actual practice? How do we make sure that the data can come together, can support analysis, which can then support policy and decision making? And that's where we've got to start holding each one of us ourselves accountable. That, for instance, whether it be the Sahel, whether it be South Asia, the Bay of Bengal, whether it be Central America, we need to start focusing on projects which provide a global good, a public good for everyone who's interested. Over.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. Kanta, some remarks from your side, please.
Thank you, Esley. My comment is, I think we are sort of in a space where we have to work in tandem. You know, we got to keep going at sort of the analytics, hear the bottom-up voices, reflect on a sort of cohesive understanding of the issue. And then at the same time, it's not going to be perfect. There's no golden bullet, and it's going to be iterative, but it should be additive. So we try to bring more value added to the data, the analysis, the understanding. And at the same time, I think we really have to address the policy front. I mean, there is no doubt in our minds, all of us, that this issue is unfolding, and it's unfolding faster than we like. And so is it going to be perfect? No, I think it's a sort of a journey that we're going to sort of take together and improve as we go along, because we will not have perfect data, perfect information, sometimes maybe not even total inclusiveness in all of that we want to do. We should strive towards it. We should push towards it. but I think it's really important. So I think just wanted to put that sort of need to sort of work together, but also work, in this sort of tandem fashion. I just want to come back to David's question about this research and communication. I think that's really important. I think, it's sometimes the media, of course, and I think some of us also, are in the boat where we present the data and then the big numbers get taken up. For example, in the Groundswell, it's so much more than the 143 million, for example. But that's what we all, so I would really like to think about the stories that can come out of it, the narrative, the call to sort of, have step changes in some of the way that even some of the growth trajectories are going, which are not recognizing these big phenomena that could sort of roll back some of the development gains. So I think it's an all-round approach that we also need to tell the stories better. And I think some of the bottom-up stories are really important. Some of the good actions that some of the policymakers are taking also, for example, like we heard about some time ago in Vanuatu, in Fiji. So there's good action, and I think we need to draw attention to that. But no doubt that I think we need to continue to pay attention and focus on this issue, which isn't going away very soon. Thank you, Atle, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Kanta. And moving on, Alex, I see that you have already replied to David, but over to you, some final remarks.
Sure, thanks, Ale. So on the topic of big data, I think that my general perspective is show me the money. Is this actually going to provide anything useful in terms of an actual humanitarian intervention that was altered in some way? I think call detail records may be the closest to that, and Veronica can speak separately to that question. I certainly, in the efforts that we made, I think there's some potential promise, but it's still some ways from being, a silver bullet in any sense. And we're still a long ways from using these data in any kind of humanitarian intervention context. Remote sensing perhaps farthest along, but not really perhaps with a view towards displacement per se. Others may disagree. I find David's topic really compelling, and I put in some notes that, happy to chat with him further offline. We've done some work for Scenarios Future. There was a conference last year in Denver, which was really looking at the shared socioeconomic pathways and climate scenarios in general. And there's a whole session on communication. And the truth is that we as scientists are not good at this. We often create far too many scenarios. We don't know how to boil it down to something that's useful for policymakers. And we dump the data over the transom and basically say, you all make sense of it. So I'm actually trying to do more work to bridge some of those things. My last point is simply about the narratives. And I do think that having worked directly on Groundswell and really found it, I find it compelling. I love the work as a scientist. I do, on occasions, I am a little bit concerned that there may be a narrative, partly because of the way the media picks up on certain numbers or whatever, that basically becomes one that maybe becomes self-fulfilling. In other words, I've heard, for instance, in parts of the Sahel, that people are basically saying, well, why should we stay in our villages when we know that climate's going to have such a dramatic impact? And that then becomes the tail wagging the dog, and I don't think we want that in any way. I think we want to actually use the information we have to actually hopefully drive interventions that would make people have the choice of whether they want to move or not, and give them those opportunities so they're not involuntarily immobile, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That was some great reflection. Veronique, you have the floor for some final remarks.
Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity. And yeah, we're also scientists at Flowminder, so again trying to also to bridge the gap between not focusing on publishing research, although we do that as well, but on trying to have data used and results applied. So we did a lot of issues there on bridging the gap. So we do need partners for this, both in academic and also governmental partners in the countries that we work in, and organizations. An example of the data being used is in Mozambique, where we're building this automated monitoring system with the Institute of Disaster Management there, so with the government, where that will give them access to prepare for to this data, to prepare for the next cyclones, to look at the resettlements that are still happening and the recovery from the 2019 cyclones in Mozambique. But so again, this data, they're quite good because they have this high update frequency, and they are large scale for the whole country, but they show only one part of the population. And so that's why we believe that what's really important is to integrate them with other data sources, and so to work with partners who collect data on the ground, so that we can have a more complete picture. So yeah, essentially I see our role as supporting this endeavor with a different data source, and with support on data engineering and signal processing, this kind of thing, so that in the end we can have a better picture of displacement in the very short term, the immediate response, but also on the long term, over years. So for both sudden onset and slow onset disasters. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Veronique. Robin, some final remarks and observation from your side?
Oh, thank you, Atle. Well, as you might imagine, I'm really concerned. You know, I mean, I've been part of this conversation now for a really long time, and people on the ground are not being given the resources that they need to make the decisions for themselves about how to respond to the climate crisis upon us. And I just wonder, you know, with the big data, like we're talking about a climate crisis that is going to go on for centuries. And you know that when you have outsiders coming in and creating big data, it's snapshots in time. And how long is that going to be able to continue? And if people on the ground are given the tools that they need to respond and monitor what is happening, then we are empowering people to make these really difficult decisions about where they're going to live and how they're going to sustain their livelihoods. And I think that that needs to be the focus, because what we have set in motion in regard to the climate crisis, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people not being able to stay in their homes.
Thank you, Robin, for these remarks. I understand Erica will go first. So Erica, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you, Atle. Just wanted to emphasize, again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share these findings today. This is really an informative and wonderful session. I think we wanted to just emphasize that this is very much multi-stakeholder, and addressing these knowledge and data gaps on planned relocation in particular involves a tremendous number of actors who've been working on this for a really long time, and that moving forwards, there will be additional work led by GIZ specifically focused on Southeast Asia and the Pacific and the regional hotspots of planned relocation cases in those regions. And I also just wanted to conclude with a reiteration of how important multiple complementary epistemologies and ways of knowing and ways of researching are in order to address knowledge and data gaps on climate and disaster-related displacement. I feel very struck moving out from this conversation by how mutually reinforcing all of these different ways of knowing and ways of producing knowledge and data are as we embark on the collective efforts to address knowledge and data gaps in this area. Over to you, Sanjula.
Great, thank you. And thank you again too for the opportunity to present. I think the only thing I wanted to kind of re-emphasize is that this research that Erica and I have done is intended as very much a preliminary data set, and intended as a data set that is meant to be built on in iterative processes where further knowledge can be gathered on planned relocation cases. And we already know that there are efforts towards producing a data set based on French and Spanish language literature that's going to be led by IOM. And we also plan together to maybe look more deeply at roughly 10 case studies to identify, as mentioned earlier, to identify situations where protection sensitive policy and practice can be promoted. So, for example, to understand if there are secondary relocations that are risks for some populations who have already been relocated, and to consider how better understanding of those secondary relocations might support better policy and practice. And I guess one last thing I wanted to emphasize is this multi-hazard context that Erica has already talked about. It's really, having looked at these cases that we've seen, you can see the slow onset and the acute hazards coming together in a way that maybe is harder to see when you're looking at internal displacement or adaptive migration. In these planned relocation cases, you see the acute displacement taking place, and you also see the slow onset scenario of changes in sea level rise and erosion that's impacting people. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from planned relocation in understanding the intersection of a disaster, an acute disaster, and these slow onset processes. So that's also something to ponder about, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sanjula. I see that David has turned off his video. I was going to give him a last opportunity, but I think you got some good response to your question. So if you want to say a few words, I'm not going to put you on the spot.
That's okay, thank you. I thank the panelists and speakers for responding to this, but I don't know that I have anything else to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. So this brings to an end this third session. So I just want to, on behalf of the co-chairs of the Data Knowledge Working Group, IDMC and IOM, I would like to thank all the speakers. Also on behalf of the chair of the advisory committee, Professor Walter Kalin, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this session. I think this was great. What we will do now, we will put together the 3 sessions. We will do some thinking and discussion together with the co-chairs and see what is it we can take from these 3 sessions that brings us forward in terms of the work plan, the action plan, and some of our priorities coming up. So this has been very useful. I cannot really speak on behalf of the other 2 sessions, but I'm sure that we have such a good outcome now from these 3 sessions. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We are about 12 minutes over time. That's my responsibility, but I also felt that we needed these extra minutes. So have a nice evening, have a nice afternoon, have a nice morning, wherever you are. So thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy.